Nancy Ammerman is a neighbor. She's from Boston University, where she's taught since 2003. She works at the intersection of theology and sociology. And so she serves as professor of sociology of religion in the sociology department of the College of Arts and Science and in the School of Theology. In addition, she serves as associate dean of the faculty for the social sciences in the college. I always find it fascinating to see the kind of focus that a professor has in their research and in their study, and examining the way in which faith is expressed in people's lives, both within faith communities and just in the daily lived experience. This has been the focus of Nancy's work throughout. Her most recent research has focused on the social structures and practices of everyday lived religion. Her most recent book, which came out in 2013, Sacred Stones, Spiritual Tribes, Finding Religion in Everyday Life, which is out from Oxford University Press, documents the way religion and spirituality operate across the many domains of daily lived experience, and the way in which the sacred is encountered both within and beyond the boundaries of our religious communities. This follows her 2006 book, Everyday Religion, Observing Modern Religious Lives, which is an edited collection of essays exploring lived religion in Europe and the United States. Earlier in her career, Dr. Ammerman spent many years studying congregations. Her 2005 book, Pillars of Faith, American Congregations and Their Partners, describes how America's diverse congregations do their work. It was awarded the Distinguished Book Award by the Religious Section of the American Sociological Association. And it followed her 1997 book, Congregations and Communities, which tells the story of 23 specific congregations and how they encountered various forms of neighborhood change within the community. And these are from congregations around the country. Her first book in 1987 was Bible Believers, Fundamentalists in the Modern World, which was a study of an independent Baptist church in New England, exploring the way in which its members make sense of their lives. So that attention to resurgent conservatism continued with her book, Baptist Battles, Social Change and Religious Conflict in the Southern Baptist Convention, which received the 1992 Distinguished Book Award for the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. There she provides a historical and sociological account of the divisions that faced Americans' largest denominations. She also contributed sections on Christian movements for the volume on the fundamentalism program of the American Academy of Arts and Science. Dr. Ammerman has lectured widely in the United States, Europe, Israel, South Africa, and China. She is frequently quoted as a news source on a variety of topics. And we are delighted to have her back here to the STM this evening to offer insights in and response to the question, who are the nuns? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nancy Ammerman.
Thanks so much. Well, it's really a delight to be here and to see you all here. My goodness, you've packed the room. And to have the fun of talking about who are the nuns to a group of Catholics. You know, of course, that this is a bit of a play on words, but it's a specific kind of play on words because it's a result of people who were doing survey research on mostly American religion and asking a kind of standard survey question that people ask, do you have a religious preference? Now, some of my colleagues think that's in itself kind of a funny question, a religious preference. But then the survey poll taker will say, you know, are you Protestant? Are you Catholic? Are you Jewish? Are you something else? And if they say Protestant, then they go through the whole long list of, you know, what kind of Protestant are you? But then the possibility is always that the answer is actually none of the above. And that's where the none comes from. It's simply shorthand for the people who, when asked if they have a religious preference, say, no, I really don't have a religious preference. Now, I'm going to unpack a bit just how ambiguous that answer is in a minute, but I want to say a bit about why it has become, why we've got a full room tonight, why it has become an issue, why we're paying attention. Because up until the mid-1990s, as long as people have been doing surveys from the 60s basically on, the number of people who were in that none category typically was around 6 to 7%. And it wasn't even usually the same 6 or 7% every time. We used to say that nuns were not very good at reproducing themselves. Because it was the case up until the mid-1990s that the people who had grown up with no religious preference were very likely to turn into a something rather than a nothing when they grew up. And the people who were nuns now might have had a religious preference growing up. So there was a lot of sort of stirring around in the category. Well, something started happening in the mid-1990s. And that stable sort of 6 or 7% all of a sudden started skyrocketing. And from the mid-1990s till today, we've moved from 6 or 7% to over 20% of the American adult population saying they have no religious preference. But there's more to the story than that. And the more to the story is in this graph, which has to do with who says that they have no religious preference by age cohort. That is, the oldsters. Very unlikely. They look like what the numbers looked like, for all those years. And then the pre-boomers, still very few say they have no religious preference. Here's the boomers. They're starting to bump the numbers up a little bit. And the silent generation, that's people born between 1965 and 1980, they're at the sort of national norm right now. But look at the 20-somethings and the 30-somethings. Among the 30-somethings, we are at a full third of the population being in that no religious preference category. So if you're talking about young adults, we're talking about a very significant portion of the American population saying, I don't belong anywhere. None of the ways that you can talk about having a religious affiliation, feeling like I can put that label on myself, none of those fit who they want to say they are. Now, as I suggested, this is a pretty mixed up category. There are a lot of different kinds of people in this no religious preference category. It's still the case that if you break that 20% up, only the little tiny top of it is actually people who are convinced atheists. They really and truly know that that's who they are, and it's not just that they don't have a religious preference, they are serious about not believing. Another 4% or so are people who are kind of sure they're not believers, but still want to leave the door open a little bit. But most of that 20% is actually people that the Pew Religious Forum that did the major religious landscape study a few years ago that talked about the rise of the nuns, they call these folks nothing in particulars. It's not that they really are sure they don't believe. It's just that none of the above quite fits them, okay? And when you dig a little deeper and ask, what do they believe? What do they do? What's their religious practice, if any? It's all over the place. Yeah, indeed, 2/3 of them say religion's not important to them. But only 28% say they don't believe in God, and that's, again, there's some mushiness there. 59% say they never pray, but that means that, roughly 40% of them do sometimes pray. They've got at least some connection here. Then there's this spiritual but not religious category. About 38% of them say that they are spiritual but not religious. I'm going to say some more about that in a little bit. But 43% say that they're neither spiritual nor religious. So, you can read between the numbers there and say there's still a bunch of them that are praying. There's still a bunch of them that think they're spiritual. There's still a bunch of them that believe in God. This is not a kind of monolithic, they want nothing to do with anything spiritual or religious category. They also aren't very consistent. Another survey that has come along says that, and this is a really interesting survey because it's what's called a panel survey, which means they literally are going to the same people from one survey to the next. So they ask this very same person, do you have a religious preference? Survey number 1, they say no. Come back 5 years later, survey number 2, they say yes. Even if all their answers on the belief and behavior questions really haven't changed. So it's almost like, you show up one day and you think, I kind of grew up Catholic. And okay, I'm Catholic. So we're talking about a group of people that doesn't have a very firm grip on their religious identification. So they can kind of waffle in and out of categories on surveys. So there is this group that the researchers who did that particular survey called the Liminal Nones. Liminal meaning on the border, on the boundaries of something, right on the threshold of things. So they're right on the boundaries. They sort of move in and out. Sometimes they're a nun, sometimes they're not a nun. But there is also a category that they identified in this same survey where they've gone to the same person more than once, and these people are more sure. They really are nuns. They're what these researchers call stable nuns. And they are different from the people who are the liminal nuns. They are younger. Are we surprised? And here's a really important thing, they attended religious services less often when they were growing up. They've got less rootedness. More likely to be raised by parents who were nuns. Here we are, the nuns are reproducing themselves, right? Very different. And they are also more likely to be married to somebody who is also a nun. So we've got a category of people who are pretty entrenched in not having a religious affiliation, not having a religious preference. So we'll call this sort of disconnected group number 1. Okay, really the most disconnected, the most nun of the nuns. These are people who don't have strong religious roots and who often have actually a very strong aversion to religion. One of the things that people discovered as they started to try to study what's this increase about is that there were 2 important sort of root factors that were fueling the increase in the number of people with no religious preference. One of them was the increasing number of people who had parents who didn't have religious preferences and who didn't, in fact, bring them to religious services very often. So the religious roots part. But the other had to do with the way, in the 1980s, visible religion in American culture often got linked to conservative politics. And so what you had was a group of people who were coming along who didn't really have much experience of religious communities themselves. And what they saw on television were people who claimed to be religious and who were doing and espousing things that this group of people wanted to say, I want nothing to do with that. So we had a kind of push-pull or drift away and push away kind of process going on. The liminal nones, the people we're going to call disconnected group number 2, the nothing in particulars, the people who aren't so firmly rooted in that none category, are on the margins for a whole variety of reasons. And I'm going to come back in a few minutes and talk some more about why it is that they are on the margins. But one of the things that it's important, I want you to get in your heads right now, is that this group of people that isn't participating in a religious community is not necessarily a group of people that is leading thriving religious lives or the spiritual lives without a religious community. There's a myth out there among a fair number of people who say, well, you know, it's really all our fault. We're really bad people in the church, and we should, you know, they were right to leave us, and they're probably better off. They're probably living a better religious, spiritual life without us. Well, I want to dispute that, and I'll give you some good data and stories with which to dispute that in a minute. So, different kinds of disconnected people. Some really rooted in being disconnected, some on the margins. So where does this disconnection come from? Some of it is demographic. And I want to just briefly kind of run through some of the things that have made it harder to keep people sort of in place, to maintain that ongoing sense of connection to a religious community. One is, in fact, geographic and job mobility. It's not so much that people are moving that much more today than they used to. That's really a phenomenon since World War II. People have been moving at a fairly regular pace. This is a 5-year mobility graph. And the people you really have to worry about for your parishes are the people who are moving within state but across county lines, and the people who are moving between states or from abroad. This sort of 6% every 5 years, those are the people who move too far away to keep coming, right? The rest of the folks may still kind of be connected. That doesn't sound like a whole lot, right? But first of all, add it up. It's that much every 5 years, over and over again. But look at what the numbers look like for those very young adults we've just been talking about. About a third of them have moved in that 5-year period. So whereas it's only about 5 or 6% of all households, it's a third of young adults that have moved, and half of that third have moved across county lines, more than just to a new apartment down the street. And part of the reason for that is the fluidity of jobs. I'm sure you're aware of the degree to which the job market doesn't look like it looked 50 years ago. And that shows up in 20-somethings, where 2/3 of them have been in their job 2 years or less. And almost half of 30-somethings have been in their job 2 years or less. People are moving physically because they're moving in their jobs. And that just makes it more difficult to maintain, to get them in the door in the first place, to maintain a sense of, I've got this ongoing religious connection, a religious set of identifications, because today I'm an administrator, tomorrow I may be slinging hamburgers, who knows? So what that all adds up to is that how we think about what it means to be an adult, and therefore likely to maybe come back to church, is different. And it's different because it takes people longer to get there. People in their mid-30s look more like people in their mid-20s did 50 years ago in terms of their the fact that they're actually working full-time and financially independent, that they're living away from mom's basement, that they have married and that they're starting to have kids. Those are the kinds of things that were in people's heads. That, that's what it means that you're an adult and you've settled down. And those are precisely the people who, if they strayed while they were, teenagers and singletons, they, in the olden days, might have come back, right? Because they hadn't been away all that long, right? They left for college at 18, they sowed their wild oats, they got married at 21 or 22, and by 25, they're doing all this stuff, and they're coming back. But what we're looking at now is they've maybe been away half their lives. They left at 17 or 18, and they're now 35. And that gives them a lot of time to get into the habit of not having church habits. Okay, so challenge number 2. Those households that they eventually form don't really fit that old church mold that we have. So who's likely to be in church, right? Married couples. I'll be more specific. Married heterosexual couples with children. It's still the case that that's the demographic group most likely to attend religious services. In the 1950s, that demographic group constituted 50% of all households in the US. Want to guess what it is now, before I show you the graph? Married with kids. 21%. Less than half. So one of the explanations for the disconnectedness is demography. The people that the larger culture says, you really ought to be involved in a religious community. There are just less of those than there were. Our larger culture doesn't say to the empty nest household, oh, you really shouldn't go off to the beach this weekend. You should be, no. Our culture doesn't say to the unmarried person without kids, the single person, you should be there. Our culture doesn't say to those categories of households, this is something we expect of you. So we've got another source of disconnection here. So one more challenge that poses an issue for staying connected. And it's ironic because we are in fact more connected than we've ever been in some ways. We were talking about this before we started here. We have networks of friends that are not necessarily defined by geography, right? I talk to my 95-year-old mother in Missouri almost every night. Now, did she talk to her mother every night? No, actually she didn't. I am more connected in many ways to her than she was to her mother at the same stage in life. But I'm not living in the same place. Of course, she didn't either. But we are connected in lots of ways, but not necessarily in those geographically located ways. We're more connected over a broader reach of geography. I think this is such a cool map. This is a mapping of where the most active Facebook activity is across the world. And notice, yeah, there are sort of non-lit up places, but they're kind of everywhere. And one of my most active Facebook relationships is with a woman who lives in Morocco. Would I have had that sense of connection to her before? No. So we're in a really interesting position here where there are both ways to be connected and ways in which those connections aren't necessarily rooted in the places where we think of as forming our religious affiliations and involvement. So people are sometimes disconnected by all that demography, but sometimes they're disconnected for much more personal reasons, much more about their own lives. Sometimes it's because their own lives have changed. They've moved, they've gotten married, they've gotten divorced, they're in a different kind of place. And we could just resign ourselves to the fact that people are going to be disconnected across all these demographic lines, but I think we shouldn't. I'm going to come back in a minute to say some more about those marginal folks and what's disconnected them that's more personal. But before I do that, what I want to do is remind you that this matters, that the connections matter, that those local communities, those face-to-face relationships, that hands-on stuff that we all do together really matters. It matters because those local parishes and congregations are absolutely critical in the safety net in our communities. It matters because those local communities are often places where people who are otherwise minority groups in a community have their place, a place where they can feel safe and feel accepted and have their own language and their own food and all of the rest, and find their way into American culture and the larger culture by way of those connections that they make with each other. These kinds of connections in local communities are absolutely critical as well because of the way they build up our store of good connections in our society. If we think about the kind of despair and outrage we're seeing all around us in this political season, I mean, think about the kind of repair that needs to get done in our communities to make that not so prevalent. We need what the sociologists and the political scientists call social capital. We need these connections that allow us to build up trust in each other, that allow us to have a sense that we can communicate with each other and we can work together to get things done, that the world isn't completely chaotic. We can build it. Well, where do you learn to do that? You learn to do it in these face-to-face communities like our congregations and parishes. Another way to think about this is the way these kinds of gatherings allow us to build up civic skills, the really basic building blocks of democracy, where you're working together in a community and you have to get up in front of somebody and express yourself in public. You have to learn to write things so that you can persuade other people. You have to learn how to organize meetings and, preside and come to decisions. The kind of stuff we do in church and parish councils and in committees and in St. Vincent de Paul societies and all the places where we gather together and try to get stuff done, that's all building up these basic skills that people need. So it's really critical that we not devalue the gathering together. It's important for the people who gather there and become better neighbors and better citizens for doing it. So it's better for our larger communities. Our larger communities need these places to be working well, to have people there doing this work. But I think our faith itself needs our engagement with each other and supporting each other and reminding each other of what's important in our lives. So why do people end up coming when they come into a faith community? This is also from the Pew Forum, and I just want to highlight a couple things about what people said when asked in a very open-ended way about why they have chosen to join a new religious community. These are people who had made some kind of a change. Either they weren't in a religious community and they came into one, or they moved from one to another. And top of the list is worship. Something about gathering for worship. Now they talk about it in terms of style, but I think the experience of the worship turns out to be really important, as does a sense of actual connection to God. They felt that God wanted them to make this change, move into this community. And they liked the pastor, and et cetera. Married somebody. Those life changes continue to be important. But keep in mind that spiritual connection, that it's those spiritual concerns, that connection to God, that is making those initial connections to a congregation. And I'm going to argue throughout this presentation that it is those spiritual communities that then sustain a spiritual identity and practice. So it's when people actually get involved in a religious community that they're able to nurture their spiritual lives, and of course they quit being a nun. We'll talk more about how to get them over the threshold in the first place. But note that there's something about the worship service, right? If they actually attend the worship service and feel compelled by it, that's an important first step. So I am going to talk a little bit here about the research that I did on spiritual narratives in everyday life. We asked people to talk to us about their everyday lives, tell us stories about what's going on at work, at home, et cetera, and listened for the degree to which where any sort of connection with something spiritual showed up in those stories. And out of all of those stories that we listened to, we were able to kind of see that there are different kinds of spiritual populations, some of whom are going to correspond to the nuns. So we're going to get back to the nuns here in a minute. Four in particular. One, clearly not nuns, okay? What we call the spiritually serious. These are people who, in fact, do attend worship services on a very regular basis. They are people who have active individual spiritual practices, praying, meditating, reading scripture, all kinds of practices that people were involved in. Really critically, they were involved not just in going to worship, but in places in religious communities where they were able to actually talk about their faith. These are the conversations that I came to call the spiritual tribes. These are the people who came together around some sense of shared spiritual life. And these are people who also have friends and family in their congregation. So you can see a kind of, there's a way in which spirituality is woven through a variety of the connections that people have. It's part of their family life, their friends, their acquaintances, the people they're with in their congregations. So that's the spiritually serious. Those are not the nuns. The typical members are people who do, in fact, have a religious preference and a religious affiliation. They've got a place, and they're reasonably regular in their attendance at this place. But they don't really participate in anything other than showing up for the worship service. And they've got at least some spiritual practices of their own, but they're pretty occasional and a much shorter list of things that they're engaged in. So, these are people who are not disconnected, right? They're still there, but they're not the people that are, getting the gold stars from their favorite religious education teacher. Okay, here's one of our disconnected groups, okay? The marginal members. These are people who do think of themselves as having at least some spiritual identity. And they have a connection, but their list of religious practices or spiritual practices is very short, and they hardly ever actually participate in any religious community. So, you know, they're not gone, but they're pretty disconnected. And then we do have a group. So stop. I'm going to talk about the marginal members some more. The marginal members, I think this is one of the most important groups for us to understand because they're not gone. They're not completely nuns. They're those liminal nuns, right? Moving in and out. So why are they on the margins and not at least typical members? Well, as we listen to people talk about who they are and what's important to them, sometimes they were on the margins of a religious community because they genuinely disagreed with the beliefs that they thought were the things you had to believe to be a part of that religious community. But I have to say that disagreement over belief and doctrine is not really the dominant story here. The one place where you do hear that story is the story of the person who says, you know, I grew up in this religious tradition that said you had to believe X, Y, and Z. And then I went to college and I took a religion class or I took a biology class or, you know, whatever it was. And I discovered that all that stuff they taught me was bunk. And I haven't darkened the door of a church since. So that there's a kind of, you know, really clear break where nobody, while they were in college, taking that biology class or whatever, said to them, oh, by the way, you can be smart and believe too. There are a lot of people out there who really don't think you can. So that's one of the stories, but it's by no means the most frequent one. Frankly, the most frequent one is, I went through a crisis in my life and nobody was there. Nobody cared. Nobody came around. They were more interested in getting my pledge than in, you know, taking care of me. I think we can't talk about the marginal members in this context without also talking about what's happened in the Catholic Church in America and in the world, and the way in which the loss of trust for many people has been devastating. And even if they really want to be there, for many people, it has been just really difficult to say, I'm going to go back. I'm going to cross that threshold. There's a really interesting line in the movie Spotlight, if you've ventured to see it, where one of the young reporters is standing on the balcony and saying, you know, I always thought when I got married and had kids I would go back. And I won't. You know, that's not the whole story, but that's not a piece of this picture we can't ignore. That there are people who are sitting on the margins because there's a kind of personal sense of, I can't trust the institution I thought I could trust. And then there are just the changes in life situation that put people on the margins. They were connected in one place, they get divorced and move, and you know, how do they reconnect? So thinking about this marginal member group, I think, is a really important part of what we as people who care about these communities of faith and care about these people need to be thinking about why they are where they are. The fourth group is this truly disaffiliated group, the stable nuns, the people you're frankly going to have a really hard time getting across the threshold, because they never go to any religious services. They don't view religion positively at all. They've been outside of religious communities basically their whole lives. They don't know anything, right? It's not part of their habits. It's never been part of their habits. So you're talking about a really major kind of life-changing obstacle in getting from the kind of habit of life and situation in life that that group of people is in, and any kind of attachment to a religious community. So what have we learned about this relationship between being in a religious community, not being a nun, and having the kind of spiritual life that makes a difference? That makes a difference to the larger world, that makes a difference in your own way of living. The first thing that I just want to return to, that I said early on, is I think it is a mistake to see this exodus from the church as somehow a harbinger of some kind of spiritual renewal. That these people are going to shed the shackles, and they're going to lead the way into the future. What we see is that the people who don't have any kind of ongoing connection, attendance, participation, are not seekers. They're not people who are engaging in lots of spiritual practices themselves, leading this vibrant spiritual life on their own. They're not opposed. They're just not engaged, and they may in fact be a little tone deaf because they really haven't had that experience. Bottom line from the research I did in terms of what makes a difference in having a spiritual life that makes a difference, attendance matters. The more deeply engaged people were in places where they could have these conversations that nurtured their spiritual life, the more deeply engaged they were in those kinds of conversations, the more they were also active in individual spiritual practices, and the more they were then actually translating that into the way they lived their everyday lives and seeing a kind of spiritual dimension and connection beyond just what they're doing on Sunday morning. So when we think about the margin between those spiritually serious people, who are really making it matter, and the people who are more typical or more on the margins, what we also see is that the preaching and worship are kind of the threshold experiences. This is where people make it out of the strictly nun category and toward something else. But it's really those opportunities for friendship and learning and service together and conversation with each other. That's really the bricks and mortar of the spiritual life that I think we're probably hoping happens. Bottom line, spiritual lives need spiritual communities. And that's why the rise of the nuns is something that we should be concerned about. And I think that's why you're here tonight. And so let's talk. So as I said, it's open season, and they're coming in with the microphones. And if you have a comment or a question or want to add something, just tell the good people with the microphones and hang on to it until they get there.
Okay, I have a thing here. So I'm from Burlington, Vermont, and lived in Denver. And the group that's my age, I'm 28.
Yeah, you're those nuns.
Yeah. There's a huge explosion of community going on. So the thing that comes to mind immediately is like breweries, which are huge spots where most people are not spiritual or religious, and yet they're engaging in things like meaning making, culture, arts, community gathering, deep conversations on topics. I mean, so I guess my question would be, where have you seen with this age group the benefits of what's going on? Because I think there's something new and unique, and I think at a lot of levels spiritual happening that's not confined to the traditional ways we've understood congregations. So what do you see are some of these benefits of the nuns? Because I think there's really cool benefits.
So
You
I
know?
want to draw a distinction between the nun who doesn't happen to be in the church and the nun who's disconnected. I think you're absolutely right that a lot of younger adults especially are discovering all kinds of new ways to gather. One of the things I do a little bit with is a website called studyingcongregations.org, and we're just posting a series of blogs about new ways of gathering, drawing on some work that was done at Harvard Divinity School you may be familiar with, that looks at a lot of the sort of, the brew pubs and such that are the places where people are gathering, eating together, making meaning together, etc. I think sociologically that it's absolutely the case that whenever people gather with a kind of openness to and intentionality about allowing for a spiritual dimension to enter into their conversation and to guide them in some way, that's way better than nothing. Way better than nothing. And we can probably learn a lot from what's going on in those places. If you haven't seen James Fallow's piece in The Atlantic this month about communities that are reviving, the sort of like get off the coast and get into the middle of America and you'll discover it ain't so bad. One of the things that he says is a marker of a community that's on the upswing is that it has a brewery.
Well, it's a
Go
very
figure.
like white mid-20s American kind of thing too. But in that demographic, which is a lot of what the nuns in my age, a lot of them are white middle-class people.
Okay. Yeah. You got the mic? He's got the mic, so he gets the next question.
Thanks. So, Dr. Ammerman, I want to go back to your comment. At the end, you talked about, you said the nuns are not seekers. Does that mean, this, so when you think about the highly active seekers of the boomer generation, maybe of Generation X, is that like a phenomenon that never really existed, or it has disappeared?
I think the notion that we've had a major portion of our population that has been actively engaged in seeking new religious experience and new spiritual experiences, I think that's a myth that really never was there. I think we discovered in the 1960s that there were a lot of other alternatives out there, and in fact, there were more people doing those things. But the notion that characterized an entire generation, I think, yes, Wade Clark Roof, I love you, you're my friend, but the book, A Generation of Seekers, I think overstates it. Yeah. And certainly, the people we interviewed, who we selected to be a really broad and pretty representative sample of the American population in terms of their relationship to religious organizations, we did not find that there was this group of people who weren't connected to a religious community but were actively looking. Pew does not find that either. There's nothing in particulars. They are not seekers. When they ask specifically, are you looking for another religious community? No.
Thanks.
In the back.
Yeah, I'd just like to react, if I could, to the gentleman's comment earlier, and not to take anything away from the position that you took and the advantages of these newly developing communities. But my sense is that most people of faith would probably believe that the church community serves two functions, not one just of connection with neighbor, but also connection with God. So that your new communities might be able to be satisfying in some ways, very successful, one of those dimensions, but the other is probably more important.
You know, I think theologically and as people who are rooted in religious traditions, we certainly want to argue that you're exactly right. Ecclesiologically, that's what it means to gather, is you're gathering both as humans, but humans in relationship to God. And so sociologically, then I look at those new gatherings and say, how are they similar and how are they different?
Hi, so I'm 19 and I'm a freshman at Boston College and I'm a philosophy minor, and something that you said really resonated with me because it reminded me of one of my classes. I'm in a perspectives philosophy class, and a lot of my classmates, once we started talking about different religions and like reflecting on the past, felt like they were lied to in childhood, or that they like didn't feel comfortable going even to church anymore because they didn't know if what they were believing it was necessarily true. So what would you say to this generation who's questioning how they were raised? Like, how do you gather them back in and have something to believe in and have like a community to go to?
You know, the question of how you deal with that crisis of I can't believe what I used to believe is such an important question. And I am such a strong proponent of campus ministries and, you know, of having people on the campuses who are willing to gather students and say, okay, you know, there's no admissions test here. You know, just come for pizza and we're going to talk. Yeah, it's always pizza, isn't it? Yeah. And, you know, we're going to talk, and we're going to talk about that crazy belief you don't think you can believe anymore. And maybe ask, well, you know, what is it? Is there still something you can believe, that you do believe? And do we start there? I'm not a campus minister, but I think it's just so important for people who are in religious communities who care about this to be really intentionally in conversation with and connection to their kids who are in college. Yeah. You guys are important. Okay, we've got the mic in the back.
Yeah, one thing that strikes me that I wonder, with the experience that a lot of us probably have these days in our parishes, it feels very transactional in the sense that a lot of people come for an hour a week and then they go back home. And to a certain extent, if these younger generation is striving for connection, they're striving for community, I suspect that a lot of them aren't finding that in that 1 hour a week. So we can say, well, that hour is when you connect to God, but to a certain extent that's a theological point to be making with them. And a lot of, there are, I understand, parishes and communities that do have a greater sense of community, but for most of us and for a lot of what these kids experience if they go out of that much smaller set, I suspect it doesn't feel that connecting as a community, and therefore they're challenged about why should I be part of it?
You know, I think that's, you know, that's the contrast between the people whose primary connection is through just the worship service, and those who have some connection beyond the worship service, who have a connection through, you know, some sort of mission project they're involved in, some sort of study group they're involved in, some, you know, pizza and questions group that they're involved in, that there's some place where they do have that face-to-face connection, where they do have an opportunity to actually talk to each other. I mean, when I started analyzing the stories that I was looking at and looking at the difference between the stories of the people who I've come to call the typical members and those that I called the spiritually serious, it really did have to do with, did they have the spiritual tribes? You know, did they have this group of people where there was conversation more than anything else, where they actually were engaged in talking to each other in a context in which, and here's the theological part of it, in a context in which it was permissible, expected, part of this tribe that the spiritual was present. So, you know, opportunities to converse in a context where you expect the sacred, the spiritual God to be a part of the conversation. And let me just make a little side comment here. You'd be amazed how many people in churches don't think they can have a conversation with their fellow church members about God. That's too personal. And yeah, so I would just really want to encourage you, it's okay to talk about God in church, not just the priest. Somebody else has got the microphone?
Yes. I want to address the 1% of Americans are incarcerated, either as detainees or prisoners, and 7% of Americans are in the incarceration system involving parole, probation, and post-incarceration programs. I work with this group, and I've noticed that in the past 5 years, even the short time I've been working full-time, there's been a drift in the group under 35 to be unfamiliar with congregational life. And so the question isn't that they are against faith, it's that they
They're
are
nothing
unfamiliar with faith.
Yeah.
They have been raised in environments where faith has not been, you know, one of the conversations taking place. And denominational religion has become a problem because when we go in as Catholics, most people under 30 today don't know the difference between Protestantism, Catholicism, evangelicalism, Pentecostalism. This is completely over their heads. So this is a problem because our society is still, and our churches are still so denominationally minded. And this again extends now to the interfaith equation, where sometimes we're not coming together with a common witness. So we are fighting over adherence in prisons and jails, as well as in American society, at a time when we need to be calling them to the so-called, to use the language of AA, higher power. So that's one question I have, is how do we come to a greater common witness so that those who are seeking are not being given such an array of religions that they're like the immigrant coming to a shampoo aisle in a grocery store where there's been one brand and now they're confronted with 50.
Yeah.
And the second question I have is studies in therapeutic systems for people in trouble have revealed that the sense of self today, the philosophical sense of self, is under siege, so that people are not incorporating into their sense of self a kind of transcendent dimension. And in law enforcement communities, transcendent values can be replaced by commodified values. And the family and the flag and all of these very American values can sometimes replace, they're not truly transcendent values, and they can replace the role of faith communities and religion. So I just wanted to bring those two.
Oh, thanks. Those really important points. And I just want to say something about the people who don't know anything and how important it is for us in religious communities to take that into account. To take into account how completely intimidating it would be for somebody who has never been in a church of any kind to walk into your sanctuary, to walk in, and there are all these books, and there are these kneeling things, and there's, images, and there's what they'll say is mumbo jumbo. They have no idea what's going on. So how do we welcome people like that without making them feel stupid? Okay. I think it's always helpful for people in a parish from time to time to walk in and imagine you've never been there before. Imagine you're from the moon. Imagine you know nothing. What would you be puzzled by? What would you need to know? What would you want to know? And how could you imagine somebody from within the parish being a really welcoming guide who would, sit by you and say, oh, now's the time when, and sort of walk you through what's going on, be your translator through what's going on. How do we think about, groups of people who are gathered precisely because they've not ever been in any religious community and they're just curious and want to know. There are just lots of opportunities for those kinds of, there are seekers in the sense that, they'll come to a nice lecture that's going on, or they'll come to some gathering where they're going to get a pizza and Coke. They'll come to those kinds of gatherings just out of curiosity. So how do we think about introducing something that hasn't ever been part of their lives in that kind of very low-key way, often in a pub, often someplace where they already feel comfortable. Yeah, you've got the microphone.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the element of trust there.
Mm-hmm.
How bad is it? And is there any hope?
Well, the PR issues are really bad. But those are overcome at the personal level. If somebody has absolutely no experience with the Roman Catholic Church and the tradition, or doesn't know anybody in the church, then it's bad. There's a huge wall, huge barrier standing between them and the church. But if they've got a neighbor, a friend, a family member, who just looks like a good person and is willing to sort of meet them on the margins in that liminal space around the thresholds, maybe not necessarily saying, we need you to come back and sign up for RCIA. No, there's this group from church that's gonna go, serve meals at Rosie's place. You wanna come along?
Is with Pope Francis, is it?
It helps. Yeah. Precisely the kinds of people who are distrustful and turned off, and the nuns. He's a very visible anti-Jerry Falwell, if you will. Here, this is not a link of this is somebody who is, not progressive and, is religious. So, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, your topic is very, very interesting and very wide and enormous. One of the points that I wanted to speak about is what they say in the scriptures, that the harvest is great, but the laborers are few. And this is what we are experiencing a lot of, the vocations in the priesthood, the nunhoods, the structures have changed. And people, especially I'm talking for people, immigrants, I'm an immigrant myself, but I came here formed already. And people come from outside, they come to new churches here, to the churches. They find the style of worshiping is different, and don't have enough attention. Probably the pastors or priests who are there are either too tired or spread out between so many parishes, and the nuns have modified their lives so that they can still keep their mission going. And I praise those women anyway. So there are so many things that are facing the churches or worship places that still need to be looked at.
Yeah.
Who is going to help them and who is going to work on them?
The notion of the laborers being few, I know, is felt keenly. And one of the things that I would just suggest is that we need to probably expand our definition of the laborers. And I'm not advocating, I won't go there. But thinking about the work of the people, the work of the church, being work that we're all charged to do. And yes, those laborers are fewer than they might have been before too. But the way we're probably going to get past the question of, do we have enough ordained clergy leaders is by spreading the burden more broadly across the people who are a part of the church. Yeah.
Thank you. I have two questions. One's more, I think, simpler than the other. The first is, where would you, from the research you did on the types, the typical and the marginal, where would you put or place someone that probably most of us in this room might call a cultural Catholic? The Christmas and Easter crowds and kinds of things. Are they typical or are they marginal? Somewhere in between?
Yeah.
And the second question, the last slide, spiritual lives need spiritual communities. You have a face-to-face gathering people inside a church. Where does the digital space either undo that mark or transform it in some way? And here I'm especially thinking of the work of Sherry Turkle.
Yeah. Actually, that one's the easier one for me to answer, because I think the digital space adds to, but doesn't necessarily undo this face-to-face community. I think what we've seen over the couple of decades that we've really been serious about this question of digital connection is that it does not, for most people, replace their face-to-face spiritual connections. It augments it. It often is, in fact, the threshold or the gateway. I can just guarantee you that most people who are attending a congregation for the first time probably decided to come because they Googled it. And if you don't have a good digital presence that really conveys who you are and what you're trying to do, they're going to ignore you. They'll never know you're there. That's that business about it. It's not about the geographic community. The connections get made other ways. Okay, back. The C&E Catholics. I think they are kind of halfway between the marginal members and the typical members. Yeah, they certainly are. They're still connected. They know where they're supposed to go on Christmas and Easter. Although they may be shopping for that too. Who's got the really great Christmas pageant? Or who won't ask my kid to be an angel, I don't know. But that's an interesting challenge, I think, for all of the traditions that have a really high premium on a kind of sacramental worship that says, the most important thing for you to do is to participate in certain kinds of liturgical activities, and as long as you've done that, you can kind of check things off. It's not just Catholics. We certainly see that in other traditions. Are those people likely to have a really vibrant spiritual life? No, probably not. Are those people likely to have the ability to engage in spiritual conversations that really nurture their own faith. Probably not unless they get hooked up with some people who have more than a C&E kind of relationship. So they're working with a really thin well, not a very deep well. And so I think we need to think about them as people who, among other things, are really easy to lose. Their kids, I mean, think about what their kids are experiencing of religious upbringing. We go on Christmas and Easter because grandma wants us to, not because it's part of our family and our traditions. So I think those are people that are interested, and it's an interesting population to pay attention to because you haven't lost them, right? But they really do need connecting, and they're easy to lose. Yeah. Who's got the mic?
Thanks. Just, I was wondering if you could say more about, you said a couple of times something like preaching and music are the threshold. Could you say a little bit more about what you learned about that?
Yeah. When I looked at how these different groups of people described what it was they experience when they do attend religious services, it was interesting that the most spiritually serious group actually didn't talk about sermons very much. They might talk about music, but mostly in terms of participating in the music, singing. We have a congregation that really loves to sing, and I love to sing with them, and so you'd get those kinds of stories. Their engagement was really not primarily at that level. It wasn't that sermons and music weren't important. That just wasn't where they went when you said, what's important to you about participating in a religious community? The typical members were the ones who would likely say, we have this wonderful choir, and the preacher's just great, and I really appreciate the sermons when I go, and so forth. And yeah, I think there's a bit of a spectator quality to the way they interact with their religious community. And it also meant that they were quite willing to move from one congregation to another when there was a lousy preacher or a bad choir. So, again, the connections are not so deep, so it's pretty easy to leave. But I think it's also important to say that's what people notice first. Okay, so if that's not there, they're never going to come back the second time to make the friendship. So it's a bit of a both-and story.
Hi.
We've got the mic in the back.
I'm an STM alum, and I'm also a first-year theology teacher and campus minister at an all-girls Catholic high school.
Yay!
Thank
Good
you.
for you.
So I had a question about could you explain further about the spiritual but not religious element? Because a lot of the girls, particularly the seniors, as they're going off to college, I field a number of questions. And I, of course, allow those questions to be heard because a lot of them have had that experience in a church or with another individual from a church where they weren't allowed to have that question.
Yeah.
So I find that not forcing religion onto them is kind of a way to allow them to enter into a faith and a spirituality with God, first and foremost, before even approaching the possibility of a church community, because that is like overwhelming to them at 18, 17, 18.
Yeah.
So could you speak a little bit more about the spiritual but not religious element, especially in that age group?
You're describing such an important phenomenon, and I want to say just a couple of things about this. I've written a lot about it, so I'm going to try to keep myself in check. this is still really true. For those people who say that they're spiritual but not religious, I think you're absolutely on the right track by saying let's give them the opportunity to talk about what they mean by being spiritual. Give them the opportunity to explore what it means for them to be spiritual without telling them you got to also be religious. Because the point is not so much to tell them they got to become religious as to say they need places where they're going to be able to continue to talk about that. And if they don't have a community, they will very likely lose the sense of what it actually means to be spiritual. When I'm feeling quite hard-nosed, I say that most of the people who say they're spiritual but not religious are really neither. And what they're really saying to us when they say they're spiritual but not religious is, look, I know it's not a nice thing to say you're an atheist or you don't believe in anything. I don't want to be one of those kind of people. I'm really a good person. I'm spiritual. But don't lump me in with those fanatics over there who are religious. I'm not that. So they're drawing boundaries. You know, they're saying who I am and who I'm not. And that's very much what those young adults are doing. I'm not that religious thing I grew up in. You know, I want to draw a boundary there. But I don't really want to kind of leave it all behind. You know, there's something I still want to hold on to. So I think you're doing exactly the right thing to create that open space in which they can think about what it means to be spiritual and keep exploring that. Yeah.
This evening has opened up many levels of spiritual expectations. I just want to share one thing. I don't know how many parishes, by and large, have a children's liturgy of the word, where the children go separate during the period of readings and liturgy. But there was an experience in our group in which a 12-year-old, who happened to be our granddaughter, was, you know, at the time that the gospel was read about the visitation. And of course, you know, all the children there heard the story and they understood. Well, the question came up as to why is it that you feel that the Elizabeth's child in her womb leapt for joy? And our granddaughter said, because she had a spiritual experience, a connection, a spiritual connection.
Yeah.
And I just think providing opportunities for adults to hear what children have to say, given the space for them to share their level of spiritual life, is a very important
They're important members of the tribe. Yeah.
And I think that's a good note to end on. Thanks for that wonderful presentation, Nancy. Such a pleasure.
Thank you.